There's been important political developments in the US and in France in the last 24 hours. In the US, it appears pressure is beginning to build in the Democratic Party for their candidate, President Joe Biden, to drop out of the presidential race against the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, partly because of performance in a debate 10 days ago, but also just because of his general demeanour. Meanwhile, in France, it seems an alliance of left-wing activists and some in the middle have been able to work together to keep the far right out of power. Professor Patrick Bond, a professor of sociology at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Bond, good afternoon to you and thanks for your time. Let's start with the situation in France. Many people were concerned the far right would come into power, they would control the parliament there. They've been kept out. There is a hung parliament. How do you assess the message that French voters have sent in France?
Thanks for having me, Steve. Actually, as I said on Newzroom Afrika 6 days ago, it's what I'd expected, namely that there is such pressure not to have Le Pen and her crowd, the National Rally, the right-wing forces, in official power, that is, to have a parliament under their control. Even though Emmanuel Macron would hold the presidency till 2027, that the center-right and the far left agreed that they would drop their competing candidates. I think that's the message. That is cooperation and collaboration. And the left leader, there's several parties, including the old socialists, who were moving to the right, but were still social democrat. The Greens, the old communists, but the crucial one, France Unbowed, a sort of social movement left force. And they've basically said, as Jean-Luc Mélenchon, their leader, put it last night, that they would like to govern. They'd like Emmanuel Macron to basically call them in and give them the support in parliament, about 100 seats that they would need to make it to the majority, and then to actually run the state from the parliament, keeping Macron in as the president. That's the sort of message that I'm feeling from this very surprising, for many, achievement of the left at a time many of the left forces in Europe and around the world are in retreat.
It doesn't mean that the right goes away. I mean, yes, Marine Le Pen is not quite in charge of her party now, but she's really the force behind it. Before that, it was her father. This is a force that's been growing in France for generations. We've seen across Europe, Austria and other places, parties will come together to keep the far right out of power, but the far right doesn't go away.
Yes, and it's really their message, I think, that we should be attuned to, Stephen, to ask, are we seeing similar messages of xenophobia, of a sort of nationalism or ethnicism, maybe in the case of our own MK party, that represents a right-wing populism. That is, it's sort of favorable to mass support with a charismatic leader, including some of the new people coming up behind Le Pen, a 28-year-old who could have been the prime minister had their vote held. Now, the dilemma is that in some of the countries, like Britain, where you have a reform party last Thursday, basically splitting the conservative vote and taking Rishi Sunak's more conventional conservatives out of power, leaving a center-left Labour Party in power. That worked. But the EU election, which was the parliamentary election for all of Europe just the week before, allowed the right to move forward. And in Italy, they certainly have power, the third largest of the European economy. So it's a very confusing situation, especially if we jump to the US, where it's harder to see the ideology, but Trump certainly pushes the right-wing populist, xenophobic, and, yeah, to be frank, racist and sexist agenda, and is doing well, partly because his opponent is doing so poorly, Joe Biden having that terrible debate performance and now under pressure to move.
I mean, and isn't that, let's go to Biden, because I understand the pressure on Biden to drop out. The Democratic Party are very worried about losing the election. But in a situation like this, and you kind of see the same situation play out in many places, there's pressure on someone to go. But that's not really the question. The question really is, if the person goes, who would replace them? For some reason, Vice President Kamala Harris is not that popular. And I think if there was maybe a candidate people saw as stronger or as more popular there, maybe Biden would go.
I know, and this is the dilemma that he chose her, even though in the 2020 primary debates, when the Democrats were fighting each other to become the candidate, Kamala Harris was very critical of Biden on the issue of racial segregation and busing, school busing. And she said very famously, I was that girl who benefited from busing and you didn't want me to. So he then chose her, and I don't know quite what his calculation was, but they hadn't vetted her very well because her reputation, certainly for the last 3.5 years as the vice president, is one of basically babbling platitudes. And she hasn't found a way to put forward the strength of character and moral fiber that, as a former California senator and as a former California attorney general, where she was quite harsh with the African American community. Don't forget, she's half African American, actually Jamaican. Her father, a famous Marxist Jamaican economist, Donald Harris, her mother, an Indian academic who met at Berkeley. So the first person of color and first woman to be in this very important position. But the question is she ready to graduate to be president? And many people feel not. And hence, particularly in the immediate circle of Biden and his family, he's sticking in.
How does all of this end? We see the pressure building and building. You look at American TV networks, it's the only story they're talking about. I can understand why. It's one of those great sort of political soap operas of our time, in a way. A US presidential election often is. Do you think Biden's going to stay the course? And if he does, isn't he going to lose to Trump? I mean, wouldn't that be a huge risk? And yet, I can't see any other unifying figure. Harris would have to drop out first.
Well, yes, these leaders are taking gambles. I mean, it's Rishi Sunak having an election too early, losing badly. Macron gambling just before the Olympics that he could reinforce his rule, gambled badly. And I think Biden staying in would be a similar bad gamble, and he's losing in the polls, especially where we consider some of the swing states, where if you're basically running half and half, it's about 6 states that are going to be the decisive ones. And then there's the other factor, not just it's Biden now currently behind Trump in most of the polls, but the other factor is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., an independent who'd come out of the Democratic Party, but found, and of course his father was Robert F. Kennedy, a great attorney general, a candidate who was assassinated, his uncle, John F. Kennedy. He's polling 8 to 10%. It seems about half from the Trump populist libertarian wing and half from the traditional liberal and environmental wing. None of these 3 candidates, by the way, can claim that they have the support of this large movement of youth and Palestinian supporters who've been protesting at such a high level. And all 3 of the candidates are very pro-Israel, Zionist. So I think this is one of the dilemmas. Can the more forceful ideological orientation of progressives like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the sort of traditional left that has come up in these candidacies and made a statement the way Jeremy Corbyn did and now Mélenchon has in France, will they have any presence in this debate? I mean, it's going to boil down, I think, Stephen, to the convention, Chicago, in about a month and a half. And then the dilemma is, if you're in September, October, and early November is the election, will those 2 months after the, let's say, assume that Biden is reappointed? He has all the delegates, of course. Will he fumble? Will he make mistakes? Will he just degenerate? And then people will say it's really ridiculous. I just cannot vote for a man who makes the sort of, let's say, incompetent statements that Biden's been making recently.
Professor Patrick Bond, still so much to come in all of this. Thank you very much indeed. Professor of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg.